Welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. I'm Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and in each episode I have a conversation with a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Hopefully we'll also provide a glimpse into human possibility. Thanks for listening and enjoy the podcast. Today, it's great to have David Yaden on the podcast. Dr. Yaden is a postdoctoral research fellow at Johns Hopkins Medicine. His research focus is on the psychology, neuroscience, and pharmacology of transformative and self-transcendent experiences. He is currently focusing on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. His scientific and scholarly work has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, and NPR. And in addition to one of my most valued colleagues, I'm also honored to call him a friend. Hey, David, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This was a long time in the coming, wasn't it?
Yeah, we've been talking about this for years, I think, now.
We sure have. Well, it's about time we start to talk about your work on here, because it's really transformative work. It truly is, and I think it'll be helpful to a lot of people in this day and age where we're all stuck in the insecurity, anxiety kind of level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and let's help them transcend. How about that?
I like that. Yeah, I like that idea. I'm curious whether you think that there is any applicability of transcendent experiences in terms of what's going on right now. So I'm usually pretty skeptical that my work can be applied in any kind of straightforward way. But I just had a conversation with my wife where she thinks that these kinds of experiences might be really important right now, that when a lot of people are isolated.
Yeah, when people are isolated, they start to get in their head a lot. And so people get in this state, they start catastrophizing, right?
Yeah, I think so. And what goes along with any kind of depressive or anxious style rumination is a lot of self-focus. So a lot of these catastrophizing thoughts are very much oriented around oneself. And we know that when you're focused on yourself a lot in a negative way, that well-being is reduced, and even depression or anxiety can follow. So I think in that sense, self-transcendent experiences do orient us outward, beyond the self, which could be helpful.
Whoa, David. So you said self-transcendent experiences. We haven't defined that yet. Now, can you define that? You wrote this, one of my favorite papers ever. You're a lead author of this great paper. Maybe you could talk a little about who your co-authors were and how you found them. Like how did you all come together to write this review paper on self-transcendent experiences and kind of come up with a consensus definition?
Yeah, thanks for saying that. That was a long time in coming, that paper. I worked on that for years, actually. And it really was an honor to work with these researchers, my co-authors on that paper. They're kind of a dream team, I think, on the topic. And I learned a lot about even just how to write an academic paper, but certainly a ton about self-transcendent experiences. So the second author on the paper is Jonathan Haidt, who I'm guessing you've had on here before.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's thought and written a lot about why we have these self-transcendent experiences from sort of an evolutionary perspective. He's also defined several emotions that involve a self-transcendent aspect. There was Ralph Hood, who was one of the earliest researchers to study mystical experiences, which involve a deep sense of unity or feeling completely at one with all things. Dave Vago, who does a lot of the neuroscience of
yes, he was on here. He was on here.
Okay, yeah. Great. And then lastly, Andrew Newberg.
He was on here too.
Okay, great. So you know all these people. And what we did was...
Well, let's talk a little about Andrew Newberg's work, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I've worked a lot with Andy Newberg. He's a radiologist, and he was really pioneering. He was one of the first scientists to put meditators and veteran contemplatives into a neuroimaging scanner and to see what's going on in the brain during deep states of unity. So we're writing a book together at the moment that will describe self-transcendent and spiritual experiences from the perspectives of psychology and neuroscience. So in this paper, what we did was we defined self-transcendent experience. So we said these are transient mental states that involve decreased attention to the self and deep feelings of connectedness. And we then went through the psychological literature and identified existing mental states, measurable constructs that involve decreased attention on the self and increased feelings of connectedness, things like mindfulness, flow, awe, peak experience, and mystical experience. So these states differ in a lot of ways, but they are united in that they each involve decreased attention to the self and increased feelings of connectedness. And they exist on a spectrum of intensity. So obviously, mindfulness and flow are not as intense or as potentially transformative as something like a peak experience or a mystical experience, which involves deep feelings of unity.
So in order to trigger these transcendent experiences, do you have to reduce your focus on yourself? Have you done the study to show that those who score high in narcissism tend to report less transcendent experiences in their lives? That would be a neat study, right?
Yeah, well, I think actually your work speaks to that at least a little bit. I think that you found that people who scored high on your self-actualization scale
yes,
were more likely to have had one of these self-transcendent experiences, or what Maslow would call a peak experience. There's so many different terms that have been thrown around to describe these experiences. William James 100 years ago called them mystical experiences, and we call them self-transcendent experiences. And of course, Maslow called them peak experiences. I think Maslow had a really important role in the history of psychology on this topic too. Because William James, he's the person that I usually go to in terms of a philosophical foundation for studying these kinds of experiences. But you've really highlighted how important Maslow is on this topic for me. And I think what Maslow did was he took away the explicitly religious or spiritual terminology from this topic and really emphasize the fact that believers and non-believers have these experiences, and that religious or spiritual beliefs aren't a necessary component of having one of these profound self-transcendent experiences.
Wow. So even before William James, I mean, the history has not treated self-transcendent experiences very kindly, right? So Freud, I forget what the quote is, but someone asked him about, what are these kind of oceanic experiences that I'm experiencing, and Freud says something like it's an erotic return to the womb or something.
That's
right.
Right. That's right. Yeah, and that was even after William James had published The Varieties of Religious Experience, and so Freud was kind of out there in left field doing his own thing, and in this chapter where Freud talks about these and you're right, he calls them these oceanic feelings of boundlessness. And he says, personally, I've never had one of these experiences, but they're very strange. They sound strange, and something like they fit poorly in our idea of psychology, something like that, where he just said, these seem strange and they don't seem to fit with his notion of normalcy. And so he just sort of reflexively branded them as pathological. And that was very influential.
It was very influential, yeah. And even William James's notion of these things, he tended to focus more on the religious aspects surrounding it. I feel like what your work is really contributing in one way, and it contributes in a lot of ways. But in one way is you're secularizing spirituality, right? You're showing that these transcendent experiences can happen. Any of us can access them regardless of what God we believe in. Is that right?
That's right. And I see my work as very descriptive. Like, people are already having these experiences across all belief and non-belief systems. So across every religion, among agnostics and among atheists. Sam Harris talks about his self-transcendent or even spiritual, I think he calls it, experience. And of course, he's very much an atheist. So I think that that's right, that these experiences do occur across belief systems. And in some ways, they are equal opportunity in that way.
They're equal opportunity. And also, I really love this phrase you say, that the all experience, AWE, and I always have trouble pronouncing that word, but the all experience is the every person's spiritual experience. Is that right? Is that what you call it?
Yeah, I like that term. When I'm giving lectures, I will often ask the audience the same questions that Gallup puts out. And, this big polling company, Gallup, will say, have you ever felt a religious or mystical experience that changed your life? Questions like this. And they're phrased slightly different in different years, but generally, very reliably, you'll get about 30% of people saying, I completely agree with that statement. I've definitely had a really intense, life-changing experience. And my interest is to explain and explore and study those really intense experiences, but that leaves a lot of people out. And so right after that, usually I say, okay, who here has had an experience of awe from, a mind-blowing idea, sweeping natural scenery, amazing art or music? And then usually every hand in the audience goes up. And so I think awe gives a sense for what these experiences are all about. Because probably right now, about a third of your listeners are saying, yes, I've had one of these experiences. Please tell me more. And then 2/3 of your listeners might be saying, what are you talking about? What on earth is this experience? And so awe, I think, helps to give a sense for what these very intense experiences can feel like.
Hey, everyone. If you find the themes we cover on the Psychology Podcast interesting and enlightening, you might be interested in my new book, Transcend, The New Science of Self-Actualization. The book is the culmination of my journey to scientifically discover the factors that can lead us to optimal health, growth, creativity, peak experiences, and deep fulfillment. I believe we can still manage to have peak experiences, the most wondrous moments that make life worth living, regardless of our current life circumstances. We can choose growth. For more, you can visit transcend-book.com. That's transcend-book.com, with a hyphen between the word transcend and the word book. If you get a chance to read the book, it'd be great if you could leave a review on Amazon, tweet about it, or share the book with friends. I truly hope this book can help people get through these tough times and realize that we all have greater resiliency, creativity, and potential within us than we ever realized. Okay, now back to the show. Yeah, so awe. Well, I've had the great pleasure of working with you a little bit on this topic and trying to understand how we could capture it scientifically. I think both William James and Maslow would have been very proud of us, I hope, in the spirit upon which we did it. Can you describe a little bit about this research on awe? Like, where are we at right now? What's the current state of research on awe?
Well, yeah, so I think, just contextualize that a little bit. So self-transcendent experiences, the way I've described them, is this umbrella term that includes this spectrum of intensity. And awe is what we'd call a variety of self-transcendent experience. So just to position it on this spectrum, our scale, which we also worked with Dacher Keltner, who's one of the real amazing researchers on awe and helped to kickstart this whole little subfield on this very interesting emotion. I think what we were trying to do there is to get away from measures that simply say, have you felt awe or are you feeling awe? And using that particular term, because then so much rides on one's own interpretation of that particular term. So our scale, I think it's 30 items, it's 6 different factors, and it never once mentions the word awe. And it captures all of these really interesting components that are involved in the experience of awe, which is this very rich experience. People call it a complex emotion because it's not merely positive or negative. It's ambivalent. It's both positive and negative. Even though we find that usually people report positive experiences of awe, there's at least this little feeling of being overwhelmed or even slightly fearful sometimes.
Yeah, you found that there was a correlation with the emotion fearful, right, or anxious.
Yeah, which is really unusual in emotion research to have both of those things happening. So awe is generally defined as, in terms of its appraisal dimensions, like what triggers awe is a perception of vastness and a need for accommodation. And so that perception of vastness can be perceptual, like seeing the Grand Canyon, for example, or conceptual, like listening to a mind-blowing TED Talk or one of your other podcast episodes, hopefully. It's awe-inducing for some people. And then a need to accommodate that, so to mentally process it in some way. And so that was part of the definition that John Haidt and Dacher Keltner stipulated when they defined awe. But we also include in this 6-factor measure other dimensions of the experience of awe, like altered time perception. So time feels like it dilates during these experiences or slows down. Physiological changes, the eyes slightly widen, the jaw slightly loosens. You might feel some chills or goosebumps.
Not in a feverish way?
No, in a chills up your spine.
Okay.
After an amazing movie kind of experience.
Okay.
And then crucially, diminished attention to the self and increased feelings of connectedness. And those last 2 are what make it a self-transcendent experience. And so I think people can take this measure on your website.
Yeah, they go selfactualizationtest.com. Yeah, it should be listed there. Do you like that?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. They could take the all experience questionnaire. So how does all differ from flow? It seems like there's some subtle differences there. Not all self-transcendent experiences are equal, right?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of these various mental states that we put under this umbrella of self-transcendent experience are more different than alike. So a flow experience, generally you're engaging in a challenging task and you're absorbed in that task. And some people who are experiencing flow say that time speeds up. So there seems to be some difference in the time is altered in both cases, but maybe in different directions.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It is, yeah. And I'm not an expert on flow as much, but there does seem to be at least a similar kind of altered time perception. There does seem to be this decrease of attention on the self. And then in flow, there's not much evidence on feelings of connectedness beyond the self to other people. But you do see a little bit of evidence about flow in a communal kind of context being potentially more impactful than experiencing flow alone. I think there's just one paper on that, so I wouldn't focus too much on that.
Wait, flow in groups?
Right.
Oh, that's interesting, especially considering our current state as the day that this is recorded is March 28th, and people are self-isolating in the room and trying to get into a flow experience. And I wonder how they can use virtual technologies, like being like online, to increase that in a group sort of way.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, seeking out community digitally, I think, will be really important during this time. But I think also unplugging deliberately will be important during this time as well. Most self-transcendent experiences are triggered when people are alone. And so the way in which I often have a mini self-transcendent experience is just going for a walk along the river.
I miss going on walks with you, David.
I know. Usually we'd have these conversations sitting on a park bench in Rittenhouse Square in Philly.
Yeah. Well, things have really changed in the world since then, since those days. I just want to talk more about these triggers of self-transcendent experiences. Like, what can we do? Let's try to just like make this as practical as possible for listeners who want to have transcendent experiences and feel like it's not possible under such situations that they're under. Can you give some people some hope that it is possible?
I don't know that I can. Yeah, I don't want to be glib, during this time and suggest that it's just a great time to experience self-transcendence. And like I said, a lot of times I'm very skeptical that my work can be applied in a straightforward way, at least. So I usually see my work as very descriptive. Like I'm trying to understand these experiences that people are already having and to do the research that's possible to do on them and to understand them and to help people understand themselves after they've had one of these experiences. So I don't think a lot about application. And so sometimes the question, how can we have these experiences in our everyday life, worries me because there hasn't been a lot of great research on interventions that induce self-transcendent experiences in a day-to-day kind of way. I think that there are ways in which we can seek out awe, little moments of awe
right
through the day.
Right. Even like little moments of gratitude.
Little moments of gratitude. I think practicing mindfulness. I mean, for me, that's one of the few practices that just very reliably makes me feel better afterwards. And I never want to do it, but I'm always glad that I did.
Well, yeah, like me too. Me too.
Yeah, we've kind of, you and I have tried to get each other, I think, to continue that practice and exercise. I think we've texted each other to encourage that practice. We have.
Okay, so psychedelics. This is a really hot topic in psychology, and really there's some rapid progress being made with even some of the colleagues you'll be working with, or that you do work with at Johns Hopkins Medicine. Is that right? Can you talk a little about your colleagues there and what they're doing on the front lines of psychedelic experiences? The science of psychedelic experiences. Sounds sexy, doesn't it?
It sounds great. Yeah, it's such fascinating work, and I've cited this research from this lab at Johns Hopkins for years because they've seemingly done what I thought was impossible. Like I said, there's just not good evidence on interventions to induce self-transcendent experience. And while I was at the University of Pennsylvania doing my doctorate, I did several studies trying to induce self-transcendent experiences in the lab. Awe videos, a virtual reality study, even non-invasive brain stimulation, and none of them really worked because they're all so subtle. And real self-transcendent experiences are dramatic and often transformative. And this lab at Johns Hopkins has been administering a psychedelic substance, which is psilocybin. And what they've found is that they can very reliably induce very intense self-transcendent experiences, which they call mystical experiences because they're at that intense end of the spectrum. And subjects in these studies will report feelings of complete unity and the self momentarily disappearing entirely, and very, very intense subjective experiences. And the experiences, their effects seem to really persist over time. So at 2-month and even 18-month follow-ups, you have increases in well-being, in pro-social behavior, and in less addictive behavior and less depression. So these seem like they're the most powerful positive intervention that's been discovered so far. And the results seem to be highly replicable. They've done over a dozen studies. So I'm really excited to have joined this team at Johns Hopkins now and to help understand why these experiences seem to have such long-lasting beneficial impacts on those people who have had them.
Can't wait to see what you discover and to get you back on the podcast someday to further elaborate on what you and your colleagues have discovered. Yeah, the psychedelics is so interesting. There's some of the research I've seen shows that the best combination is psychedelics with mindfulness meditation or some sort of cognitive processing where you integrate it into your life in some way. So Catherine McLean has quit her academic position, I believe, and is devoting her life to helping people integrate those experiences into their lives.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a psychopharmacology lab, and so to get up to speed with psychopharmacology, I'm reading textbooks on psychopharmacology, and the first one that I read was Catherine McLean's, and I have all the marginalia from her underlining certain things. I've never met her, but I feel like I know her a little bit from her her underlinings.
She was on this podcast.
Oh, wow.
She's great.
Yeah, so you already know everybody.
No, I know everybody who's worth knowing. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that this area just has an extraordinary amount of potential for transforming psychiatry and psychotherapy in the next decade. I think that within the next 5 to 10 years, your psychiatrist will be able to prescribe a psychedelic session. And so I talk a lot about this with my wife because she's a psychiatrist. And it's just such an extraordinary experience and intervention. And I think we're at a very precarious point in the research because I think that it needs to be done extremely carefully. And the Johns Hopkins group has done such an incredible job of keeping it very, very rigorous and doing, only randomized controlled trials. And I just really hope that degree of rigor remains. And more than anything, I hope that it helps us to understand just why self-transcendent experiences are so psychologically beneficial.
Good. Yeah, I want to know why they are. I want to know what is this link here between these experiences and lowering your fear of death. Like that, it seems like that's a common theme, right? That people who go through these experiences suddenly aren't so fearful of losing their self forever.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, was really impactful, I think, on a cultural level in terms of communicating the science of the psychedelic research. And what he comes down on is he says that the sense of self-loss is what's really important, this kind of ego dissolution. But what I'm finding in my research and what we've found, you and I, in some of our studies, is that it's not so much the self-loss, but rather the connectedness that seems to be driving the well-being. And
Yeah.
a lot of this is still correlational, so it's difficult to tease these mediators apart. Um, but a lot of my recent research is focused on this, and these experiences involve both less attention on the self and increased feelings of connection. They're highly correlated, but only connection seems to be really correlated with beneficial outcomes related to well-being. And that's surprising, I think. And I think that Michael Pollan and a lot of researchers are maybe barking up the wrong tree in terms of ego dissolution, and that
I
really
agree.
this feeling of social connectedness is where the real action is at.
I agree. Yeah, they focus so much on the default mode network and silencing that network. And that's one of my favorite networks in the brain. And I call it the imagination network, or the social imagination network. They seem to think that if we quell that, then we're stopping with our self narratives. But there's lots of positive things to have those aspects of the self for creativity and meaning making, right?
Yeah, I think we're at such an early phase of the research that we're doing a lot of extrapolation from very preliminary evidence. And so I agree that the focus on the default mode network, I think, is something that will probably not continue to be very helpful in terms of scientifically understanding just why these experiences are so beneficial. My prediction is that we'll see that these processes related to social connectedness and attachment will end up uh, being the real mediator of at least some of the therapeutic benefits.
What is connection in that model? It seems to me more having to do with like a universal connection with the human species than your in-group connection. Have you teased that apart at all?
Yeah, it is spoken about in that way, and we do see really high correlations with, yeah, when people say I feel this pervading sense of connectedness. Usually, well, if they're religious, they mean including God. If they're not religious, then not. But usually, this feeling of connectedness with the world, with all of life, with all of humanity, and with close others. But interestingly, if you do a path model, which is something I did in my dissertation, and you control for all these different kinds of connectedness, um, the remaining predictor is feelings of connectedness with close others. So we talk about this really global, big, far out kind of connectedness in terms of these experiences. But I think that the benefit probably lies much closer to home than we realize. How do these kinds of experiences um, reset or reinvigorate the kinds of connections that we already have with loved ones, with friends and family? That's something that I think I'd really like to investigate in the next few years, is how these experiences impact our connection with close others. Let's say when you read some of the accounts of these experiences with that in mind, it really begins to stand out how much people talk about feeling grateful for their friends and their family as a result of these experiences. And I think we might be glossing over that a little bit and focusing more on the really far out subjective phenomenological fireworks associated with the experience and forgetting about the stuff that's really close to home.
That's exactly right. Yeah, no, I agree that sometimes we focus on psychedelic, the experience of like hallucinating and seeing fairies and I don't know, whatever things you see. Have you done LSD, David? And what was the experience like for you?
Well, yeah. Well, I want to follow up on your first thing there. I think the aesthetics of psychedelia, I think, are really changing from what you're talking about in terms of seeing things, or this whole far out tie dye kind of aesthetic. Will be more and more about everydayness, treatment rooms, hardwood floors, taking time to watch sunsets. I don't know, basic everydayness and deep appreciation of that. At least that's how my sense of the aesthetics of psychedelics has changed after learning more about the research and the therapeutic potential.
Can you tell me about your quite transformative experience that you did have when you were in college, which in a lot of ways led to an interest in this, in studying this topic?
Yeah, so I have sort of complicated feelings about talking about this experience because I don't want the impression to be that I have some kind of authority on the topic just because I happened to have one of these experiences. Instead, I think talking about my experience can be helpful in that it just demonstrates why I study what I study, and that it's born out of this deep sense of curiosity, rather than me trying to prove anything one way or the other, in terms of whether there's some religious or spiritual import of these experiences or whether they're delusions. Because a lot of scientists who study this topic, their bias is very clear and they almost wear it on their sleeve.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. That caveat aside, just tell us. Tell us. I mean, I appreciate the spirit about what you're doing, but I think anyone who knows you or has listened to you for more than 5 minutes knows you're a real genuine scientist who is interested in this. So tell the story.
Okay, so yeah, this was during my college years, during undergrad, and the general context. I was sort of searching for myself in some way. I was trying to decide what to do with my life, as a lot of people are during that time. And so I always wonder how much the context really matters. But it definitely did feel as if the experience came on spontaneously. And so I was lying on my dorm room bed and I start to feel this heat in my chest, which I initially think is heartburn or something very physical. But this heat slowly begins to spread over my entire body eventually. And at some point in my mind, I hear the words, "This is love." And so at that point, I went entirely into my mind, sort of felt like I went out of my body in some ways, and felt like I could just see 360 degrees around myself. And I was completely part of this intricate fabric that spread out in every direction. And that feeling, that warmth, especially in my chest, it felt like it just reached the boiling point. And after what was probably just a minute or two, but felt like days, I opened my eyes and my body was laughing and crying at the same time. And so immediately I feel this sort of wave of love towards everyone around me, especially friends, and thinking of family. Everything seemed new. Life seemed fascinating. And future possibilities opened up in my mind. All of this really amazing stuff. It was just an incredibly profound and meaningful moment. But more than anything, I was wondering what the hell just happened to me. That was the dominant thought. And, I wondered, am I going crazy? Because I had never heard about this experience. I had never at that point heard anyone talk about this kind of experience. I'd never even read about it. And that launched me on a several-year journey, reading as much as I possibly could about this topic, from religious studies, philosophy, neuroscience, psychology. And really, I'm still reading, I'm still at it. I'm very much still reading about this experience. It's just now I'm also doing research on it myself. And what I found is that I'm not alone. A lot of people have these experiences. Like I was saying before, probably about a third of your listeners will say, I've had something along those lines. That's what the Gallup polls suggest. William James and Maslow have written books where they included dozens and dozens of accounts of people having these experiences. So that was incredibly comforting for me to know that I wasn't alone. And that's one message I think that I really want to get out there, is that if you've had one of these experiences, you're not alone. You're not going crazy. That these experiences are actually pretty prevalent and usually associated with very positive outcomes.
Yeah, it's so important to emphasize that, and I think your story illustrates that. And I'm just struck by the similarities between the description of your experience and when Catherine McLean was on my podcast. The name of that episode, if people want to see it, is, or I guess hear it, is "Open Wide and Say Aw" with Catherine McLean. I think
that's great. I have to listen to that.
Yeah, I think that's also the title of a TEDx talk she gave, but that's the title of her podcast chat as well. And there's such a similarity there in the description of the experience, and it is such a it's such a personal thing. So first of all, thank you for being vulnerable enough to tell that story. I get that, and I understand why you might have some hesitation about telling that story to too many scientists. But you have to understand that scientists aren't the only ones in this world. We have lots of people listening to this podcast that are just everyday human beings that might be terrified by a sort of experience they may have. They just can't comprehend it or understand it, and it might be very comforting for them to hear someone else who's gone through it and can say that it's okay. Like, first of all, you're not crazy. And I think that's a big thing, is just in itself saying it doesn't mean that you're crazy, Would the DSM at any point of the history of the DSM have classified this kind of experience as a mental illness?
Yeah, I think there's still some of this sort of Freudian hangover, a suspiciousness about these kinds of experiences. There's a category in the DSM called dissociative experiences. And this is a very broad category, and really any kind of mental state that intrudes onto consciousness and is in any way strange and produces feelings of suffering and dysfunction for people can fall under this category. And so it's important to note that not all altered states of consciousness are positive or beneficial, and dissociative experiences and self-transcendent experiences require more theoretical and empirical work to differentiate them, I think. But the biggest differentiator is if you're suffering or feeling dysfunction. And I should say that if you do have one of these experiences, or any kind of experience that causes substantial suffering and dysfunction, then the best thing you can do is to reach out to a mental health professional and to talk about this experience and what might be going on.
Are there going to be psychedelic counselors At some like, are there psychotherapists who specialize in this?
I think that there are starting to be. Johns Hopkins has a number of individuals who have various degrees of clinical training, helping people to undergo psychedelic experiences and to process the experience and to explain it to them beforehand. But it's also pioneering at this point, and so I don't think it's been uh, systematized the way that it will be and will need to be going forward. And so I hope to play a role in helping to create a more systematic approach to what people might expect from these experiences and how they can best integrate them into their lives.
And I do think you're interested in how to trigger them. I think you sold yourself short there earlier in our conversation when you said you don't bother yourself that much with the practical applications, because you've put a virtual reality headset on me and had me go fly into space, and it transformed me. So I think that you are interested in the intervention aspect of it, right?
I think you're right. I think I'm fascinated particularly with what's happening with psychedelic research. But my main interest with that VR study was to just model it in the lab to understand it better.
Tell us about the study. I mean, not everyone has read it who's listening to this podcast. So.
Yeah, well, so in this study we had people come into our virtual reality lab at the University of Pennsylvania and put on a headset, and what you would see when you put the headset on is that you'd be floating over the building that the research study was actually being conducted in. And then you would slowly zoom out so that you could see, the city block, then all of Philadelphia, then the state, then the country, then the whole world. And you would be, in orbit looking at Earth. And we did get people to say awe, to open up and say awe. You see their jaw literally drop, and people would say things like "wow," and it is awe-inspiring. And virtual reality research, I think, is fascinating. And Facebook has bought Oculus, so I think that all of us will be experiencing a lot more virtual reality in the decades to come, which will be interesting. But notably, that study didn't work. I mean, it induced awe, but it didn't significantly increase well-being or pro-social behavior. And so I'm very skeptical of very subtle, small interventions and their capacity to have a real impact on people's lives.
But didn't Alice Chariccio's work show more positive effects of virtual reality on creativity and stuff?
Yeah, she has shown some stuff on creativity, which I think is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that these are interesting areas, and some people get effects using awe-inspiring videos. That didn't work for me as well. So basically, I think my work at the University of Pennsylvania was useful in terms of the work that I did in terms of measurement. But what I'm really excited about now, moving to Johns Hopkins, is the capacity to study intense interventions, not subtle interventions, not watching 5 or 10 minutes of an awe-inspiring YouTube clip, or even putting on VR goggles, but to have a truly transformative experience on the couch in the lab. That's just groundbreaking, I think, to study self-transcendent experience.
I agree, and I think that's a great and important line of research. So let's just conclude here with your interest in the psychology of philosophy. This is an area that you've ventured into. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's this movement in psychology to do work on samples beyond just college undergraduates or MTurk, this common way that researchers gather data. And so I've gathered a couple of interesting samples. One from the Hadza, which is a hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania that my colleague Chris Smith gathered there, whether they've had self-transcendent experiences. And the other group is professors of philosophy. And so I was interested in how many of these individuals have had self-transcendent experiences. We measured a whole lot of other psychological traits like personality and well-being, for example, and numeracy, and to see how those psychological...
What's numeracy?
How interested you are in numbers. So
Okay.
How comfortable you are dividing fractions. And when you read an article, do you look at the data or do you just read the words? And so then we looked at how those psychological traits, on the one hand, impact their philosophical views on the other, to see if there are any correlations between those things. And one of the strongest that we found was less well-being associated with not believing in free will. So if you don't believe in free will, you have less well-being. That was one of our stronger findings. We found a substantial number of philosophers report having had a transformative experience, self-transcendent experience. And about 1 out of every 4 philosophers has taken a psychedelic substance.
Well, I'm not surprised with that. But you found that using substances such as psychedelics and marijuana predict non-realist and subjectivist views of morality and aesthetics. What does that even mean? What does that mean?
Well, so an objectivist view would be that there's some fact of the matter. So whether a particular piece of artwork, for example, is beautiful or not, that's just true. It's a universal truth. It's true for all humans, and it'd be true even if no human beings existed. Whereas a subjective aesthetics is the idea that what is beautiful changes between people and across cultures.
Okay, so for your findings, translating this into everyday language, your findings showed that philosophy professors who do marijuana or psychedelics are more likely to have a very flexible view of morality and aesthetics.
And aesthetics.
Because you also found that in the morality domain, right? So that means subjectivist view of morality. That sounds like the Joker has a subjectivist view of morality,
well,
right? Or no?
Yeah, I don't think that believing that we construct moral views and that we don't receive them from some divine plan or from some part of reality that's already constructed in terms of morality. I don't think that means all of a sudden you go out and become an immoral person. I don't think. See. Yeah. But the philosopher Laurie Paul had a really good point about these issues, where if you understand that your state of consciousness is flexible and you see that demonstrated by using a particular substance, then I think it's easier to make the imaginative leap that different people see things differently. So to put it in simple terms, my wife had a great metaphor where she's like, when you're on a drug, if you see that house plant and it looks like the most beautiful thing ever, and then the next day when you're not on the drug, it just looks normal, then you've personally demonstrated to yourself that beauty is to some extent malleable according to your mental state.
Yeah, no, I love that. And is that at odds with the belief that there are evolutionary psychology principles of certain modules that we evolved over the course of human evolution, that we all have certain moral intuitions that we share? Would that be an objectivist account? Can you have a subjectivist account and still believe that there are evolutionary principles at play here, that it's not all completely subjective? I don't know. Does my question even make sense?
Well, let's see. I think most people who think that our moral and aesthetic faculties evolved to fit with a particular environment would usually be subjectivists about aesthetics and morality, but not necessarily, because you could imagine that our capacity to sense aesthetic and moral truths is actually tracking something in the real world. That we've evolved to be able to detect something that is objectively true. In this case, what's right and what's beautiful.
Okay, so that's great. I think that's really cool that you're trying to integrate these fields and look at even individual differences in traits that might predict different views within a completely different field than psychology. Not completely different.
Yeah, well, I'm
Awesome.
learning a lot. I
Yeah.
wanted to learn about issues in contemporary analytic philosophy, and my guide through this was my childhood friend, who's a philosophy professor, Derek Anderson. He sort of was my tutor in helping to understand what each of these views mean, and we conducted this study together.
Well, you have a lot of great collaborators, which is a testament to you and your integrity and the thought that you put into your work and care that you put into your science. David, it was a real pleasure talking to you today, and I'm really excited to get your research out there to a large audience because it really is important, and I think a lot of people will benefit from it.
Thank you. And you do such a great job of communicating this complicated stuff. It's an honor to be here. So thanks, Scott.
Thanks, David. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion below. Also, please add a rating and review of the podcast on iTunes, and subscribe to the Psychology Podcast YouTube channel, as we're really trying to increase our viewership on YouTube. Thanks for being such a great supporter of this podcast, and be sure to tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.